Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Reimagined, a Hidden Compass YouTube series. I am your host, Lauren Eckert, looking very bundled up in my very cold canvas wall tent home, which I'm moving out of this week, but toughing it out as we wrap up here in winter in November in British Columbia. And I'm stoked to be joined today by friend, colleague, collaborator, Amy Romer. Amy is a visual journalist with a background in photojournalism. She's also a National Geographic Explorer, and her photography and writing, which is beautiful and we will link to below, has been widely published across outlets, including The Guardian, The Narwhal, The Tyee, and many more. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, gosh, it's our pleasure. So, as you know, we have a broad array of rather abstract questions for you. But before we get into that, I'd love to talk briefly about your current projects, what you're currently working on. I know a little bit about one of them for sure, but I'd love to hear about the diversity of what you're thinking about and writing about right now.
Yeah, it's always, one of the things that I love about what I do is it's always so varied. And for me, I always like to have something that is long term that I'm working on. And for you and me right now, that is our Fish Outlaws project, which is documenting the criminalization of Indigenous fishes in the Salish Sea and beyond. So that's like running in the background for me. And as we enter 2022, that will be kind of gearing up. We've spent some time sort of getting it off the ground and preparing. And I think 2022, that will kind of come into more of a spotlight for me. At the same time, I'm wrapping up another National Geographic Explorer project, which I feel like every week I'm saying this, but it should be filed by the end of this week. So that project was given to me before the pandemic and has been delayed because of the pandemic, but it documents the decline of Pacific wild salmon through both a traditional knowledge and Western science lens. And specifically kind of focusing on the emergence of new viruses and how fish farms are impacting wild fish. So it's kind of a complex story. And I think that's been like one of the challenges for me is like, how do you tell that as a visual journalist in a way that can be understood and a way that is sensitive to two knowledge systems and is truthful. There's a lot of information that needs to be spoken about, and it's been a real challenging project actually, but I'm really pleased with its outcome. And it's nice to have these projects that you're kind of like coming towards the end of, and at the same time you have something that you're beginning. So I feel like I'm in a really nice place right now with my kind of longer term projects. And then I'm a freelancer. So like for me, I'm always like, I spend a lot of time pitching stories to editorials. Right now I'm kind of in the middle of a couple stories that are Fish Outlaws related that I'm working on with the Narwhal. And they're kind of pending because of many reasons, but these are the sorts of stories that I'm sort of thinking about and therefore pitching about right now. I'm working on an article for the Philanthropic Journal about what it's like and what it means to photograph vulnerable populations ethically and responsibly, using various case studies of my own and others, to talk to the nonprofit sector about how they can implement storytelling, like visual storytelling, more effectively and ethically. So that's my kind of like winter assignment, I guess. I'm working on that writing. And I have next week, I'm going to be flying up to Smithers in northeastern BC for a new story with the Gitxsan Nation about one of their children who is attempted to being apprehended by the Ministry of Child and Family Development.
Oh, I didn't realize that, Amy. That's going to be powerful. Wow.
yeah, I have been given access by the family to tell that story, and I've
Wow.
been spending the past like few weeks since it was in the news.
Mhm.
They put a thing out on their media. I saw it on Instagram actually first, but I've been trying to apply for grants from the Pulitzer Center and International Women's Media Foundation to allow me to work on that more long term, because I feel
Wow.
like it's actually a story I don't want to just fly up and fly out for.
Yeah.
So my plan is to be working on that for like at least the beginning of next year, like now until the beginning,
Yeah.
moving into next year. So there's so much
Yeah, you're not
instability
busy at all.
involved in, well, not busy, but also like so much of what I do still is sitting at a desk and looking at
Sure.
emails, and trying to make things happen. But I do love it.
Yeah. Yeah, so for audience members, Amy and I are collaboratively involved on a National Geographic funded project called Fish Outlaws, as she mentioned, about overcriminalization of Indigenous fishers and nations practicing their rights to their fish. But it dovetails really incredibly. I'm less familiar with the other work you're engaged in right now. And so it's really exciting to hear about it. And the interconnections between all those stories um, are really neat to reflect on. I wonder, so this series, Reimagined, sort of touches on three overarching themes: that reconsidering commonly used words that have heavy histories, like explore, discover, imagining new worlds arising at the interface of knowledge systems or at other interfaces, and also like escaping individual comfort zones or innovating to tell stories or adventure in new ways. And there are so many directions we could go because you fall into sort of all of those worlds that I'm interested in talking about for this series. So I wonder perhaps where we should start, if this isn't scooping too much of what you're already working on. Can you give us a little bit about what it means to you to define ethically engaging with vulnerable populations as a storyteller? Obviously, like you're working on a large story about that, but it's something that's so important and at the heart of what Hidden Compass is doing as well. So I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, every project that I work on, I am faced with, how do I tell this story? And because of the nature of what I do and what I'm interested in, I'm wanting to um, raise awareness or provide a platform to stories that are less reported on about people who are marginalized and underrepresented. And so, but here I am as this like white privileged settler in Canada, um, and it's and so how do I do that in a way that I don't know, how do I do that in a way that is responsible? Um, and to be honest, like every project that I work on will have a different answer because each individual and group of people is unique. And so, for example, I this year have been working with a nonprofit called Mosaic, um, who work with refugees coming into Canada. And they wanted to make a book for the government to highlight ways that housing can be improved for refugee claimants. And they wanted me to kind of be the creative director in like imagining like how this book can be illustrated. And so but we wanted to do it still we wanted to do it in a way that still reflected on personal stories of the people experiencing that system. So we produced a project that photographed refugee claimants anonymously because their identities can't be revealed at this. They're active refugee claimants, but these are people who wanted to be involved in the project and to give back. They feel like they've been helped by Mosaic throughout their settlement process, and they, you know, a lot of them wouldn't have minded having their faces included in this project, but it wasn't for us to suggest that is a possibility. We needed to protect their identities. And that's like a good point, is that even if you receive permission from somebody to say, I'm happy to be included in this story, that doesn't mean that it's the right decision to tell a story in a certain way about a certain people or person. And so it's like constantly navigating like how you do that properly. And so, yeah, it's different every time, but honestly, like it's what I love to, it's like the challenge that I love to figure out. And sometimes that means like me handing the camera to somebody else. Sometimes that means me photographing someone anonymously. Sometimes it means avoiding people altogether and actually trying to tell the story in a way that is more of a kind of like let's zoom out on something and not tell personal stories. In the UK, before moving here, I worked on a project called The Dark Figure, which documented neighborhoods affected by modern slavery in the UK. And the beginning of that project, actually the very beginning of that project, I had the idea to make a landscape project that documented each neighborhood where victims of human trafficking or modern slavery were found. But I quickly sort of went down another route where I really wanted to speak to survivors of human trafficking, to get their stories and to include their personal kind of testimony in my project, and spent months trying to make that happen, to the point where I realized that, you know, if people are not comfortable wanting to be interviewed or photographed, then it actually isn't up to me to try and make that happen. And so we built a project that didn't include anybody, but spoke very personally about various case studies around the country. And that project was, there's a website, we can link to it, but that project was eventually has been exhibited around the UK a number of times and has been made into a photo book and has its own website, and it was successful. And, you know, that takes like quite a lot of creativity to kind of talk about something that's so complex, and there are so many personal stories within there, but to do it in a way that doesn't affect anyone. So yeah, it's a challenge that I like to set myself.
And I really appreciate that answer and the focus on context dependency. I think so often we, in a complicated world, are seeking like a checklist or easy answers for how to do things the right way. And typically that doesn't exist, because it's hard to do things the right way, especially when storytelling, like, yeah, it's such a powerful example of not wanting to reproduce harm. Sometimes means you have to be innovative and incredibly thoughtful and creative about how to tell stories that still impact the listener or the reader or, you know, the witness in a way that is emotional and profound, but also don't cost the teller of the story or the participants in the story when they've already been victimized. That's incredibly difficult and time consuming. And in a world where media often wants quick story turnaround, I imagine hard to find space for it too.
Yeah. And I guess that's something about the way I work. It's often slow and requires time, because these are like complicated stories.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not a fast-paced, news-driven storyteller for sure.
We need that though. We really need that slow storytelling. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. And then on the flip side of that, you'll come across, you know, like this Gitsan story that I'm about to work on I was approached, I've been given access, they want their story to be heard.
Right.
And that's another scenario that often I'm like not even looking for or asking for, because I don't believe it's my place to offer it, you know, to suggest it.
Yeah.
But it's also my responsibility to tell it if someone's putting me in the position where they want their story to be told. That's my job, and that's
deemed appropriate.
So
yeah,
you know, yeah, there's a whole scale, and and there are examples across all of the scale.
Well, what I really appreciate too, Amy, is like you, when you were talking about doing this ethically, you brought up your positionality as, you know, a settler. It's someone who has relatively recently moved to BC, someone with a lot of white privilege. And it's something that I feel like only recently in journalism and science and storytelling, well, white folks in particular, are working to weave their positionality into decision making and recognition that like there's no view from nowhere, that even if we try and tell stories in unbiased ways, our positionality inherently biases us. It positions us in the world in a certain way. So I love that you mentioned that. And I wonder, I'm keeping my eye on time, but I wonder, how are these positions, like your ethical approach to storytelling or these thought processes you have as you engage in stories, were those things that were always important to you? Did they develop slowly, like your stories unfold? How did you come to have that process as part of storytelling for you?
Yeah, good question. I think as soon as I began to become it was basically at university where I began to realize that it was these sort of personal stories that really interested me, where I could, you know, it's such a privilege to be able to be a fly on the wall on someone else's life. You know, like with the conversation we spoke about, you know, it's like permission to ask somebody questions or to observe somebody's life. At university, I kind of began making stories about, there was a single father who was a family friend, and he only got to see his son once every 2 weeks at the weekend. And I liked hanging out with them. And so I made a story about them. And it was and I wasn't aware that the process that I took to tell that story, which was slow and over time, was really useful. But I knew that I was making some powerful images, and I really liked it. But the next story that I made was about another old family friend, whose son, who's 12 years old, has what we called then Asperger syndrome, autism spectrum disorder. And he had told me at a family gathering that he wanted to teach people about his condition. That's what he wanted to do with his life. And I kind of, as a photographer and storyteller, was like, I can help you do that. Like, let's do that together. And so I began taking pictures of him. And because it's what I like to do, I printed them out and sent them. I think I actually sat down with him to show him like the following week, like, this is what I made. Like, what do you think? And he was the most honest, because he can't help to be, which is amazing. He was so honest with me and said, I don't like them. I don't like what you've done. Because it was showing him in a light that he'd never seen before, because he's not aware of these meltdowns or blow-ups that him and his mum call them. He's not like conscious, like when he's in this state. And so to see himself in a picture, you know, having a tantrum at his mum was really upsetting for him, because he's just not aware that he does it. And that was like a real moment for me, because it told me that, you know, like, he basically lost control through my photography, which I don't want. And so we worked together from there. I gave him a GoPro video camera, because he was also struggling with being interviewed, because like eye contact is really difficult for him. So we would sit side by side and he would like talk to the air, but it was still really hard, like putting a question to him on the spot, and expecting him to think quick enough to like give an answer. He's so eloquent and like his interviews were beautiful, but I don't think he was like particularly comfortable. So I wanted to give him a way of speaking about his experience without the pressure of me being there, and a sense of control that was given back to him. So through this GoPro camera, he recorded like video diaries, of how he was feeling that morning. And he lived on a farm and he looked after sheep, and he would take the GoPro and put the camera into the bucket full of grain, and then the sheep's head would like go into the bucket, and you just get this like sheep's head like
That is
the
so
camera.
good.
I would never have thought, like, the creativity that he brought to that project was, and the authenticity that he brought to that project was like, that was game changing for like who I am now.
Wow.
And you know, lucky for me, that was early on. But you know, it made me realize how like truly working with someone and giving someone else the power to tell their own story has to be, you know, my has to be how I work, and like what I prioritize. It's at the forefront for me. And the thing with that is that there's no right or wrong answer to any. There's not a formula for that.
Yeah.
It has to be by case by case basis that you navigate,
relational, that
you learn from, and that, you know, every project I do, I'm learning. Fish Outlaws, I'm learning so much from you guys. You know, this is, as a social scientist, like, I'm in awe of what you do and take so much from it. So yeah, like, that's what I love, is just this constantly trying to improve as a human, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so cool, that story that you just shared as sort of like a change point, or in point that informed how you carried forward in your work. One thing that strikes me about it is that, especially with the rise of social media, I think there's such a tendency to flatten people into, I don't know, like symbols or brands. And storytelling can be scary when you're the person involved in a story, because I think people sometimes feel a loss of agency or complexity. And that's such a wonderful way to approach storytelling about people, is that how could you not have them sort of co-create that story with you, because how else can they retain their agency in the process? It's really, really great. And it is so fun. I mean, this is outside of the topic of the interview a little bit, but the Fish Outlaws project is so wonderful because, you know, it brings together people of really different positionalities and expertise. And I've learned so much about storytelling and how thoughtful and long the process is. I mean, this is the case for social sciences too. It's similar in this preparation, scoping, beginning phase is slow and thoughtful. And it's been really cool to all like come together as storytellers and, you know, poets and artists and scientists, and like let our ways of knowing and knowledge creation and storytelling intermingle. It's been really cool. So yeah, super grateful for that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, like, I feel like a lot of our chats with Fish Outlaws, I'm pretty quiet, but I'm gaining so much insight just from listening to you and Andrea, and I'm hoping that in 2022, my storytelling will take more of a, but, you know, like you say, it's like slow in the beginning, and it has to be, like it has to be that way. And then,
so we're so lucky to have the space for it to be slow in the beginning. Like I don't think I could do a project, collaborative or otherwise, rushed. And maybe that's just me, a PhD student, talking 5 years into a project. But yeah, the pace is good. I like it. I'm conscious of time. I'm so grateful for what you shared. It's really awesome insight into your storytelling process, and also how the story changes you as you tell it. I think that's really neat, and we don't think about it enough. I have a million more questions, but we'll stop there for today and have you back. Do you have any, of course, we'll share links, hyperlinks to the stories you mentioned today. Do you have anywhere on social media, speaking of, that folks can follow along as you tell more stories?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, amy.roma, and you can follow me on Instagram, just Amy Roma, without the dot.
Amazing.
I think that's all. Yeah. Obviously my website, my social media can be found on my website as well. And the website is a good place to kind of check out a number of the projects that we've spoken about. Actually, I can give you some hyperlinks.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amy. We so appreciate your stories and your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's my pleasure, and it's nice to, we don't often get to just talk it out. And so
Yeah.
I appreciate the space to be able to do that.
Oh my gosh. My joy. Thank you.